We don't want to introduce any new negative pixels. That's not going to be helpful. And my first thought when I was going to do this is, well, I'll go convert from linear to log on the color page with a node, right? Wrong. Last week, we covered a niche topic on how to build a sources sequence that covers all frames from multiple timelines, and we published those ACEScg plates from Blackmagic raw footage. I strongly recommend you go watch that tutorial first if you do high-end finishing work. But what I didn't cover is, what do you do if you don't have Blackmagic raw footage that can debayer directly to ACES? And what if you're going to resize those linear plates back in Resolve for the conform? It's actually really easy to mess this up, especially if you work with node-based color management. But as always, there's a solution, so let's take a look. Let's start with H.265 off a Sony FX3 shot 10-bit log with 422 chroma subsampling. I've already run my shot namer script, given them unique names. I've added a scene metadata tag, I've added a track layer name, and I enabled the real name to use source file name in the project settings. All this was covered last week in that tutorial. Next on the color page, we're going to add our ACES transforms using the handy new shift spacebar trick, and typing in ACES and then arrow down to select it and hit return. The input transform should actually be the camera log format that was used in camera. Sometimes you can find this in metadata. For Sony FX3, that would be Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3 Cine. And then the output transform for ACEScg is just ACEScg in that long list. Usually at this step, it's not advised to apply the gamut compression. Gamut compression basically clamps off negative RGB code values, but since we're only going to write out ACES plates to EXR sequences, they can store the negatives just fine. Now, the negatives exist either because camera noise, or sometimes there's color intensities captured in camera that we're using a larger box of crayons than the color gamut that ACEScg allows, which is AP1. Now, this is a quick side note about ACES color gamuts. It's important to know that ACEScg uses a different, smaller sort of box of crayons, so to speak, versus ACES 2065, also known as AP0, and what I actually call big ACES. I don't work with big ACES, like ever. I don't work on Netflix films, I work in advertising, so maybe you need to use big ACES, but since I work in commercials and nobody ever keeps anything but those ProRes HQ masters at the end of the day, little ACES, also known as AP1, which is actually the same gamut used for both ACEScg and ACEScct, the log format. It just makes life easier. Small ACES, AP1, aka ACEScg, is still huge and very future-proof even for HDR delivery. But getting back to the ACES transform effect, if you need big ACES, the output transform should be set to what is called no transform. No transform is AP0 or 2065, but as I said, I'm an ACEScg guy. They're both linear, by the way. It's just that ACEScg is reasonable and just makes my life easier. Shift-click the ungraded clips, and then you can middle-click the graded one with the transform to copy and paste. Now, the image is going to look dark now because you're not viewing it on a linear display. But the RGB code values have actually been restored to the approximate linear light intensity that originally entered the lens, which is perfect for most compositing operations. You can feel free at this stage, if you're concerned about did I do things right, to add a second ACES transform to view the image properly on a timeline node, with the input set to ACEScg and then the output set to something like Rec 709 BT1886. Now, timeline nodes, they happen after the clip level nodes in the image processing pipeline. So you just want to make sure after you've confirmed that things look okay, that you disable that node on the timeline that's going to 709 before you render it out from the deliver page. We want to save that final transform for the very end of the color workflow. And to disable it, you can just hit Command D on the 709 node. Deliver page presets are covered pretty much in detail in the publishing plates tutorial. That should be linked down in the description, but I just want to add the reason that I actually use DWAB45, which is actually not a lossless codec, is because in my opinion, it's far more than good enough for advertising. And it keeps the file sizes smaller, really similar to ProRes 4x4, which is something we're already used to. So if I need to render out to a lossless codec, a lossless EXR codec, I would actually use PIZ because it still provides some compression. It's lossless compression, but it does the best job at retaining grain detail. But yeah, like I said, I'm a DWAB guy, and that's from DreamWorks Animation if you're curious. Preset delivery page settings, they're also available, so you can go download those from the blog post page for this tutorial up on Creative Video Tips. A lot of people don't know I make a blog post for every tutorial on here. The linear scaling problem. Anytime an image is scaled in the edit page inspector, or simply using a different aspect ratio timeline compared to the original footage, a resize filter is used to remap those pixels. Some of those resize filters, like Sharper, which is a default, or Lanczos, they can actually create some lower code values just by their design. That's how they work. And because we're actually going to reload linear light data that already has many values that are really, really low, remember the image looks kind of dark? Well, some of those resize filters makes negatives more negative, or it can actually make a pixel negative that was originally positive. We don't want to introduce any new negative pixels. That's not going to be helpful. And the way we can be sure to avoid creating new negative pixels is to convert those linear ACEScgs back into log. And my first thought when I was going to do this is, well, I'll go convert from linear to log on the color page with a node, right? Wrong. That's not what you want to do. And that's because if you take a closer look at this image processing chart from the DaVinci Resolve manual, you might notice edit sizing. That's the edit page inspector transform controls that we all know and love. That the edit sizing happens before the blue color page color grade changes. So we actually want to be in log before the image hits that edit sizing, right? We don't want to create new negatives. We got to get in log before it hits that. So in reality, we have 3 legit options as of DaVinci Resolve 20. You can use the Fusion page, right? Use the Fusion page, make sure to apply an ACEScg to ACEScgt transform. That's a log version at the end of your Fusion comp, right at the end, before it goes into the timeline. That'll work. I mean, that's an acceptable way of doing it. You'd have to do it for everything. Number 2, you could actually use project or timeline-based color management. Most of those presets put your footage into a log working space. Or 3, and this is what I actually highly recommend, the input LUT part of the pipeline. But the thing is here, we don't actually want to use a LUT file because LUTs, they actually clamp data over one. And all of that super bright data in the EXRs is going to get flattened out and turned to gray mush. But thankfully, Thatcher Freeman has created DCTLs for the ACES transforms that can be applied by right-clicking the EXRs in the media pool, choosing LUT, and then locate the linear to log conversions, and I would choose AP1 linear to AP1 ACEScgt. That's the log version. And now you or your colorist can resize to your heart's content and use ACEScgt in a safe log format for finishing. The differences here between these DCTLs he's created and are available to download from his GitHub site is that they don't clip data like a LUT. So you don't want to use a LUT to do this, okay? Even though we're using the input LUT part of the pipeline, use the DCTL. They're full float, so you have a complete ACES round trip workflow. Hey, I'm Chadwick, and because there's always so much more to learn, I'll see you in the next one.